To start off, allow me to show you the tools and equipment I used in making this project. So from left to right, I've got a toothbrush for texturizing, a rolling pin, and the third one is actually a tool for a cry-cut machine, but I like it because of the hook tip. And then I've got a needle tool, crafter's blade, dotting tool, fine pointed tweezers, and that's a screen stylus just to smoothen surfaces, and then a silicone tip brush. Those two are just DIY tools that I use for texturizing, and then a cutting blade. So for my clays, I use liquid Sculpey, Primo, and Sculpey 3, but I'm mostly using Primo. These are not the actual colors that I use as well. These are the molds that I use and cutters. My paintbrushes for the acrylic paint and separate paintbrushes for the varnish and liquid clay. And that's my oven toaster. A variety of acrylic paints that I just got from craft stores. So carry on, that's hot glue and glue gun. I've got a florist wire and a wire cutter. I've also got some fairy lights and an LED tea light. You should never use a wax candle because polymer clay is a plastic-based material and therefore it will burn. Lastly, I've got Cabot's Cabothane Clear Water-Based Polyurethane Varnish, and I chose the gloss one. So that's it for the materials. Let's cut right down to the chase and head on to making the fairy house itself. So to start, I got a glass jar and mounted it on top of a compressed tin foil, smothered with liquid clay, and secured it with a masking tape stuck halfway up the jar. With a marker, I outlined the doorways and windows. This also means the areas I want to keep clear from clay. I've rolled yellow-brown clays into thin snakes and pressed them onto the jar to form the archway for the door and the window frame. So every time you stick a clay to a non-clay surface, always use liquid clay. Then I cut a strip from a flattened clay, drawn some vertical lines to mimic the surface of wood, cut them to size to complete the window frame. With the help of a screen stylus, I pressed the strips onto the glass and cleaned the corners a bit using a silicone-tipped brush. As you can see, I just eyeballed the measurements here. It's not a very great habit, but it's quicker. Whatever's excess, I trim off. Earlier, I combined dark brown clay on both top and bottom of a yellowish brown clay, flattened it and cut it to size. It's about an inch long, and textured it to resemble a wooden plank. Then I started etching the letters J, O, A, S, H with a needle tool. This project was a gift from my friend's cute little boy. I made the window frames thicker by adding a second layer of clay, which is a combination of brown and yellowish brown clay, which I coiled like a sugar cane. For the door frame, I just bunched up a strip of brown clay and placed it on top. Using a flattened brown clay, I cut up square pieces which will serve as wooden frames for the two side windows. Each square I cut out 4 smaller squares. By the way, the thickness of my clay is number 7 on the pasta machine, or probably 2 millimeters thick. Then I pulled it gently off my glasswork surface and stuck it to the jar. Then I did the same for the other side, pressing gently with my stylus pen and making necessary adjustments. Because I always end up with scrap clays, I joined the two shades of brown colors and pressed them into the pasta machine and used them to cover the rest of the jar. Some sections I used flat, some are bunched up. The aim here is to mimic the appearance of a tree trunk. I also made sure that the jar had been pre-painted with liquid clay to help my clay adhere to the glass jar, and to also remember to cover the tin foil at the bottom. Then I rolled little pebbles of clay and pressed them into the gaps around the side windows. I used Primo Accent Gray Granite Clay, which is light gray with tiny specks of black. Then I continued covering the jar with more clay by running several lines on it, varying the depths and direction of the lines to give it a more realistic look. I used another set of combined scrap clays which I flattened to create the base of the house. In this instance, I used brown and white, same clay that I used to make the brick-like front steps. For the front steps, I formed two thick semicircles, the other one smaller than the first, and placed it on top of the other. Using one of my tools, I etched some lines to give it a cobblestone appearance. The top and bottom steps would always follow an alternating pattern, like when you're layering a brick wall, and no two sizes are ever the same. I just like the look and the randomness of it. So here I'm zooming it in a little to make it as clear as possible. At the moment I'm using my phone to film and the resolution is very poor, so I apologize for that. Now for the door, finally, I tried to mix pearl, aqua or turquoise with translucent clay, hoping that when I have put a light inside the jar, the door won't be as opaque, but that didn't quite work out as planned. Oh well, at least I tried. So I flattened the blue door, traced the desired shape with the help of a circle cutter and blade, cut it out and drew on the lines. For the door hinges, I traced out a handmade pattern on a black clay, cut and stuck onto the door. Together, I glued them on using liquid Sculpey. Then, using some scrap Primo Accent Granite, scrap brown terracotta, and a bit of white, I made more pebbles of different sizes and used them to cover the gap around the door. After that, I rolled some short cylinders of clay to create the pruned branches of the tree. On the tip, I drew rings or semi-rings using my needle tool, and then I glued them on. I decided to make two for each side, making sure to blend the edges well to the body of the tree so it won't come off. As you can see here, this is when I continued to draw lines on the tree to achieve the right texture and appearance. I found that the cry-cut tool with a hook tip had been very useful in this because it has just the right angle. The needle tool didn't disappoint as well. I went back to the front steps and textured with a toothbrush as I forgot to do that earlier. This project, I encountered so many mistakes, to be honest, that I needed to go back and rectify. Part of the experience. With a green clay, I applied what would look like an outdoor bush. Textured it with my DIY tool, needle tool, and toothbrush. I also love combining different shades of green, like you'd see in nature. Then I started making the mushrooms. I planned on making 3. I started with a white clay to make the stalk, then I'd spread one end to serve as the underside of the mushroom. With a red clay, I formed the red cap of the mushroom, then I created the wrinkles under it. Then I made little balls of white clay and placed the white dots on top of the mushroom cap. So after that, I made 2 more, one medium and then one small. Glued them onto the tree, clustered them together, and made sure that I blended the edges well. Then I added another green clay on the bottom of those mushrooms just to cover the bases, and then I textured it again. Sometimes I had to tip the jar upside down just so I can get into those nooks and crannies. At this stage, I will just quickly take you through as this was the lengthiest part of this project. So I proceeded to make the plants, florals to go with the exterior of my fairy house. This included leaves, vines, and flowers using the appropriate clay colors, molds, and cutters. This really saved me from having to hand paint everything or cut them manually. My client specifically requested flowers in colors yellow, red, and orange, but I also decided to add in a bit of white just to make the colors pop up. Having the right supplies can really make a huge difference. So for this project, I used leaf molds, at least 2 kinds of flower cutters, which come in different sizes, and even half of a snowflake cutter I discovered can actually mimic the look of leaves and greenery. Then I popped them onto the fairy house in strategic places. For the tiny flowers, I chose little white centers, blue for the white flowers, and golden brown for the bigger flowers. The contrast really made the colors pop up beautifully. And of course, it's time to add on the special signage. But before that, I needed to make it look like it was actually nailed in place. So I cut up some flower wire using a pair of cutting pliers and stick them into a tiny ball of black clay. I made a couple. Should have done 4, but I just got so lazy by then. After such a long time spent on that fairy house, I was finally ready to step into making the roof. So first, foundation. Compressed tin foil, shaped like a cone and secured with masking tape. For me, the masking tape also provides a surface to where my clay can better cling onto. Then I smother that with liquid clay. With a flat brown or terracotta colored clay, I made downward scratches and needle tool impressions. Then I cut them into strips and then into tiny little squares. And one by one, I lay them onto the roof. For the first row, half of the squares stick out at the edge. Then I add on the next row, adding a tile between the two tiles below, and just follow this through until the top. For the top of the roof, I just cut a circle shape and laid it on, then I just impressed lines with a needle tool. I attempted to do a very basic caning method for the wooden stumps above the roof. I rolled a yellow clay into a short cylinder, wrapped it with brown clay, reduced it slightly, wrapped again with a layer of marbled brown clay. Marbling, I just achieved by loosely mixing two shades of brown. Then I added some cracks, lines, and texture for a more realistic effect. I then cut the rod into two different lengths. I snipped the bottom ends at an angle as well to form a Y shape for when I'd stick them together. With liquid clay and the help of a flower wire, I perched the Y-shaped stump on top of the roof and later on added a layer of leaves underneath. Finally, I got to make the berries. For the blueberry, I mixed 1 part red clay and 3 parts dark blue, formed a ball, and poked the bottom with a dotting tool. I used the tip of the blade to make a series of triangular cuts around the dot, and then pulled the tips outward. With the opposite end of a paintbrush, I made a wider and deeper dot in the middle. Then I scraped off some powder of a white and pink soft pastel onto a cup. A matte, non-glittery eyeshadow sometimes works. Then I powdered my blueberry with it. I also made a raspberry. First, I mixed a pink and translucent clay, rolled it into a snake or worm, cut little bits, and turned them into tiny balls. I rolled a bigger ball to which the tiny ones were glued onto. I started with 1 ball, then continued on. Again, I did the brick layering style until I reached the top of the berry, leaving the top open like a crater. Then I made a blackberry as well, using the same technique, except smaller. Then I added the berries on top of the roof with liquid clay. I made more blueberries and blackberries because the more, the merrier. This was my most favorite part of the project. By the way, I have covered the base of the inside of this roof with beige clay. Not shown here because my phone died mid-film. Then I added 2 more leaves at the bottom of the berries. To cover the rim of the jar, I rolled the beige clay into a strip to color later on. I actually ran out of brown clay, so I used this instead. For fear that the fairy house won't fit in the oven toaster, I used the fan force oven. I chose to set it between 110 to 120 degrees Celsius for 40 minutes, checking every 20 minutes. Once cool and hardened, I went ahead with hand painting. First, I had to do a black wash, painting the surfaces with black or dark brown acrylic, then wiping it out with damp towel so that what's left are the darkened lines where the paint had remained. I did this especially for the walls, the roof tiles, and the leaves, not so much on the flowers. As you can see here, I'm still mostly black washing. Then later on I continued to hand paint, especially the walls, since I already used the right clay color for nearly everything else. Generally, I set at least 3 shades of my desired color: light, mid-tone, and dark. Mid-tone covered all the walls, very close to the yellow-brown color of the clay. I used the darkest shade on the nooks and crannies and crevices to create the illusion of a shadow, and light to sometimes yellow for raised areas. That gives the project more dimension and depth. Also, when hand painting, I normally prefer dry brushing or with very little water, so my colors are solid and brush strokes are less apparent. I do 2 coats with drying time in between. Once my base colors are set, I very lightly dry brush with white. The wispy white creates that look of wear and weathering, just like house paint slowly wearing off. Be careful not to apply any pressure at all though. For the roof, I like to go with up and down strokes, and for walls, horizontally, focusing more on raised areas. Once my paints have dried fully, preferably after 24 to 48 hours, I then apply the varnish to give it gloss and protection as well. Although I missed filming the ceiling part of the roof, I managed to film the add-on that I have made for the ceiling. I created a ring with a diameter that fit into the mouth of the jar and some adhesion points to easily stick it onto the base of the roof or ceiling of the already baked roof. I did this because I found that the roof didn't sit quite nicely on top of the jar. I also decided to paint the underside with gold acrylic. As an experiment, I gave the roof tiles copper paint highlights and I absolutely adored it. I varnished it thereafter. And ta-da! My berry medley fairy house had been a very fruitful endeavor. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, suggestions, and constructive criticisms, please leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to thumbs up, subscribe, and share. Thank you for the support. Mwah. When you're grown up, baby, you will